It had been a quiet, uneventful week when Sarah received the letter. It came in a thick envelope, black as midnight, with no return address. The handwriting on the front was unfamiliar, elegant, and curved with strange, almost ornate strokes. Her name was written there in gold ink, Sarah Oakley. She frowned, running her finger over the surface, as if she could glean something from the paper itself. Inside, there was a single sheet of thick parchment paper, folded once, and sealed with a wax stamp in the shape of a key. It wasn't the usual kind of invitation. She hesitated for a moment, then unfolded it. You were invited to the last gathering, where you may meet the ones who never left. The words were typed in black, bold text, and beneath them, there was a simple address, 12 Hollow Street. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The name, Hollow Street, was one she had heard before, but not in a long time. It was a place whispered about in town, a street that no one dared to walk down, a street that existed only in rumors. People said the houses there were abandoned, their windows dark and shattered, and that the street itself had once been home to a family who vanished without a trace. She hadn't thought about Hollow Street in years. It was one of those places that, even as a child, she knew to avoid. A place with a reputation, with a history that no one liked to revisit. The invitation felt wrong, but curiosity gnawed at her. Who would send something like this? What kind of gathering awaited her there? Her hand trembled as she set the letter down on the kitchen table. She considered throwing it away. There had to be some mistake. Yet, the more she thought about it, the more the idea of visiting Hollow Street tugged at her. Maybe it was the fact that Sarah had always been a bit of an outsider, having spent most of her adult life trying to keep her head down in a small town full of whispering families and long-established traditions. Or maybe it was just the feeling that something was unfinished, like a chapter in her life that had never quite been closed. She couldn't stop thinking about it. Something, some dark pull, drew her toward that place. She picked up the letter again, studying the wax seal. There was no other explanation. The curiosity won. The question wasn't whether she should go, it was whether she could afford not to. The drive was longer than she had expected. The landscape outside her car window had grown less familiar as she moved further away from town, the familiar suburbs fading into dense forest. The road twisted and turned like a snake, leading her deeper into unfamiliar territory. The streets were empty, and the evening light cast long shadows against the trees. There was something unsettling about the silence. When she finally reached Hollow Street, her heart began to race. The street was just as she remembered from childhood, a place that felt wrong. The houses were old and decaying, their windows boarded up, the shutters hanging loosely from rusted nails. The road itself looked abandoned, cracked asphalt overgrown with weeds. A strange fog hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The place was as dead as the stories said it would be. Sarah slowed the car as she reached the address. At the end of the street stood a house, one that looked more imposing than the others. Its tall, twisted iron gates creaked in the wind. The windows of the house were dark, but she could feel something beyond them, something watching her. The house was alive with a kind of stillness, like a predator waiting in the shadows. Her pulse quickened. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end. She parked the car by the curb, the tires scraping against the gravel. The air was thick with anticipation, yet the oppressive silence seemed to stretch out endlessly. Sarah hesitated, unsure if she should proceed. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly, but in the end, the need to find answers pushed her forward. She stepped out of the car and walked toward the gate. As she approached, it opened slowly, creaking like an ancient door that hadn't been used in years. There was no one in sight, no one to greet her, no sound other than the wind. But she knew, deep down, that she wasn't alone. Her footsteps echoed as she crossed the front yard, her eyes scanning the surroundings. The house loomed over her like a shadow, its darkened windows staring down at her, as though they were waiting for her to make the first move. Finally, she reached the front door. It was ajar, slightly swinging with the breeze. Her hand hesitated just above the doorknob. What if this was a mistake? What if the invitation was a trap? But the invitation had already been answered. She pushed the door open, stepping inside. The house was dark, the only light coming from a dim, flickering chandelier overhead. Dust hung in the air, thick and unmoving. The floors creaked under her weight as she moved further into the entrance hall, her footsteps breaking the silence. She felt something in the air, an unspoken heaviness, like the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for something. "Hello," she called out into the shadows, her voice barely above a whisper. There was no answer, only the distant sound of a clock ticking. The grand foyer stretched out before her, a vast space that should have been filled with warmth, but instead felt cold and empty. The furniture was covered in white sheets, and the paintings on the walls were all turned away from her, their faces hidden in the darkness. She took a step forward and noticed a staircase leading up to the second floor, its wooden steps worn down from years of neglect. A faint sound echoed from the second floor, footsteps, slow and deliberate. She froze. For a moment, she thought it was her mind playing tricks on her, the stress and fear of the unknown making her imagine things. But the footsteps grew louder, closer. "Is someone there?" she called out, her voice trembling. Nothing. A cold gust of wind swept through the open door behind her, slamming it shut with a force that made her jump. The sudden noise startled her, and she turned to face it, heart racing. But as she did, she caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of her eye. A figure stood at the top of the stairs. It was impossible to make out any details, just a vague silhouette against the dim light. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, staring down at her, watching her. Her breath caught in her throat. Then, in the silence that followed, she heard a whisper, a faint, rasping voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "No one comes back from here." Sarah's breath quickened. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, drowning out the faint whisper that had echoed through the room. "No one comes back from here." The words hung in the air, cold and unsettling, like they were meant to paralyze her, to keep her rooted in place. But Sarah wasn't one to succumb to fear easily. She swallowed her panic, straightened her shoulders, and forced herself to look up at the figure standing at the top of the stairs. It didn't move. It simply stood there, tall and indistinct, like a shadow among shadows. Its presence sent an icy chill down her spine, but she couldn't tear her eyes away. Her mind raced, trying to process the situation. Was it a person? A ghost? Something else entirely? A gust of wind rattled the windows, making them creak. The figure remained unmoving, its features too blurred to discern. Sarah's instincts screamed at her to run, but something, curiosity, dread, maybe even a perverse sense of duty, kept her rooted to the spot. "Hello," she called out again, her voice wavering, desperate for any sign of life. There was no reply. The figure didn't flinch, didn't respond. It simply stood there, as if waiting for her to make the next move. A moment passed, then another. "I'm not afraid of you," Sarah muttered, but the words felt hollow as soon as they left her lips. She wasn't sure if she was trying to convince herself or the figure. It didn't matter. The silence was too heavy, too all-encompassing. Her fingers twitched, aching to reach for the door handle, to escape before things grew worse. But there was something pulling her forward, something she couldn't quite understand. Slowly, she moved toward the stairs, her feet dragging across the dusty wooden floor. Each step felt like a leap of faith, each movement filling the space with a growing sense of dread. Her breath was shallow, and she could feel the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. Still, the figure didn't move. It remained at the top of the stairs, as still as death itself. When she reached the bottom of the staircase, she hesitated. Her fingers hovered over the banister, cold and clammy against the wood. Something about the house felt wrong. like it was suffocating, as if it were a living thing, pressing in on her from all sides. The air smelled damp, stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. Suddenly, the floor beneath her creaked. Sarah froze, her body rigid with fear. She couldn't move. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee from this place, but her legs felt like they had turned to stone. The figure on the stairs didn't move, but the air around her seemed to shift. The whispers began again, soft at first, like the rustle of dry leaves, then growing louder, more insistent. They weren't just words. They were feelings, emotions, pressing into her mind, forcing their way in. "You shouldn't have come," the voice hissed in her ear. Her pulse raced. The voice was distant, yet right beside her, like a cold breath on the back of her neck. The air around her thickened, and the house seemed to groan in protest. The walls felt as though they were closing in, and Sarah instinctively backed away, her feet stumbling over the floorboards. Her heart was hammering in her chest, and she was sure that the whispers were no longer just in her ears. They were inside her head, burrowing deep into her thoughts. She turned back toward the door, but as she did, the air shifted again, and the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. The sound rattled her bones. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She was trapped. No, she wouldn't let fear control her. Not this time. She turned toward the stairs again. The figure was still there, still waiting. The silence was unbearable. But then, for the first time, the figure moved. It wasn't fast, but it was deliberate. Slow, measured steps down the stairs, its shadowy form cutting through the dim light. As it descended, Sarah could feel the temperature drop even further. Her breath came out in shallow puffs, visible in the air like clouds of smoke. The figure was almost halfway down the stairs when it spoke. "You're too late." Sarah's stomach churned, a deep, foreboding sensation twisting inside her. What did it mean? Too late for what? The figure's voice was deep, thick with something ancient and cruel. But it wasn't just the voice that chilled her. It was the presence, the overwhelming sense that something was terribly wrong. The figure's outline flickered and warped, like a distorted shadow, as if it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. "You shouldn't have come," it repeated, and with each word, Sarah felt the floor beneath her feet tremble. The house was alive. The figure took another step forward. A sudden surge of panic shot through Sarah's chest. She couldn't breathe. The oppressive weight of the house bore down on her, closing in from all sides. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, reaching out for her like fingers, wrapping around her legs, pulling her closer. She turned and ran. Her feet hit the ground hard, and she stumbled, nearly falling, but she didn't stop. The house was alive, and it wanted her. "No one comes back from here." The words echoed in her mind, louder this time, like a chant, like a warning. But it was too late to turn back. She reached for the door again, but this time it wouldn't open. The handle was cold beneath her fingers, and she yanked on it with all her strength, but it was as if the door had been welded shut. Panic surged through her chest. From behind her, she heard the figure's voice again. "There's no escape." She turned, her legs weak beneath her, her breath ragged. The figure was standing in the doorway now, blocking her way. It had come closer without a sound, and Sarah realized it wasn't a person. It was something else, something that wasn't entirely human. Its body flickered like an image on an old, broken television screen. Its face was an indistinct blur, and its limbs were too long, too angular, like they didn't quite fit together. "No one ever leaves this place," it whispered, its voice now a rasping growl that sent a jolt of fear through her body. "And you won't be the first." The shadows behind it seemed to shift, swirling like smoke, coiling around her, constricting her lungs, pressing against her skin. It was suffocating, and Sarah could feel her knees buckling beneath her. She tried to scream, but the words wouldn't come. Her chest tightened, her vision blurred, and as she collapsed to the floor, the last thing she heard was the figure's voice, cold and merciless. No one comes back. Sarah's body trembled, her skin slick with cold sweat. The air in the house seemed to thicken with an unnatural weight as she lay on the floor, her limbs feeling heavy and numb. Her vision swam in and out of focus, the shadows around her twisting, curling like living creatures. The voice of the figure, distorted and rasping, echoed in her mind, even though it had stopped speaking. No one comes back. The words seemed to echo, not just through the house, but through her very bones. She tried to push herself up, but her arms wouldn't respond. It was as though an invisible force was pinning her down, suffocating her. Her chest constricted, and she gasped for air, her heart pounding furiously in her ears. "It's not real," she whispered to herself, her voice shaking with fear. "It's not real." But even as she said the words, she felt a deep, visceral truth. This place, this house, wasn't just haunted. It was alive. Alive with a hunger that fed on fear, that devoured those who entered and never let them leave. Her thoughts spiraled as she fought to clear the fog from her mind. "I need to get out," she thought, but she could barely move. Every movement felt like swimming through molasses. Her limbs were slow, unresponsive, weighed down by an oppressive force she couldn't understand. The whispers began again, filling the room with a rising crescendo of voices, too many to count. They didn't speak words anymore. They were emotions, raw and piercing, a collection of sorrow, anger, and agony. "Help me. Get out. Don't let it take you." Her heart skipped a beat as a new voice joined the others, a voice soft, pleading, like a memory she couldn't place. It was faint, but clear enough to pierce through the chaos, to bring her back to herself. "Please, you're not alone." Sarah froze. "What?" she whispered, her breath shallow and ragged. The whisper had felt so real, so close, but who could be speaking? The voice wasn't from the figure, or from any of the shadows. It was coming from somewhere deeper, somewhere inside the house. Somewhere familiar. Her mind raced. Could it be another person? Was there someone else trapped here, like her? She pushed herself up, her arms trembling as she propped herself against the floor. With an effort, she managed to stand. Her legs wobbled beneath her, unsteady, but she forced herself to move. The house groaned around her. The air seemed to close in tighter, suffocating her. But still, she moved forward, the faintest thread of hope pulling her deeper into the darkness. The hallway ahead of her stretched out, long and narrow, disappearing into the shadows. The whispers grew louder, more distinct now, each voice pulling at her like an invisible hand, dragging her toward the unknown. She couldn't tell if they were real voices or if they were her mind playing tricks on her. But it didn't matter. She had to keep moving. There was a door at the end of the hallway, one she hadn't noticed before. It was small, almost hidden by the shadows. Her feet carried her forward, drawn to it as though by some invisible force. With each step, the air grew colder, and the whispers became more frantic, pleading, as if they were trying to warn her. No one comes back. No one. The door was old, its wood rotting and warped. Sarah reached for the handle, and as her fingers brushed against it, the temperature dropped even further. The icy chill wrapped around her, like a blanket of fear. She hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should open it. What if it was worse? What if there was nothing on the other side but more darkness, more traps? But then she heard it again, the faint, desperate voice. "Please, help." She took a deep breath and turned the handle. The door creaked open. Beyond it was a small, dimly lit room, its walls covered in cracked wallpaper, peeling like old skin. The air in the room was thick, stagnant, and the smell of mildew and decay hit her in waves. But what caught her attention wasn't the room. It was the figure standing in the center, bathed in a pale, ghostly light. It was a woman, thin and frail, her skin pale and paper-thin, stretched over her bones like a delicate mask. Her eyes were wide, hollow, staring at Sarah with an emptiness that made her blood run cold. She was dressed in tattered, faded clothes, her hands trembling as they reached out towards Sarah. "Help me," the woman whispered, her voice hoarse, like it hadn't been used in years. "They won't let me leave. They won't let anyone leave." Sarah took a step back, her heart racing. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice shaky. "What is this place?" The woman's mouth twitched, but no words came. Instead, she raised a hand, trembling, and pointed toward the far corner of the room. Sarah followed her gaze and froze. In the corner was an old mirror, its surface cracked, reflecting only darkness. But it wasn't the cracks that caught her attention. It was the shape in the reflection, faint at first, but unmistakable once Sarah focused on it. The figure, standing right behind her. The same figure from the stairs. Sarah spun around, but the room was empty. No one was there. The air was thick, oppressive, but the figure was gone. When she turned back to the woman, the reflection in the mirror had changed. It was no longer empty. It was filled with dark shapes, flickering shadows that shifted, stretching, reaching out toward her. The woman in front of her gasped, her mouth opening in a silent scream, her eyes wide with terror. "No one comes back." The words echoed, louder this time, and Sarah stumbled backward as the shadows from the mirror began to move, creeping toward her like a flood of black ink. They poured out from the reflection, twisting and wreathing, swirling around her legs, dragging her toward the mirror. "Help me," the woman cried, her voice breaking, her body twitching as if the shadows were already pulling her into the glass. "You have to leave. You have to." But it was too late. The darkness was everywhere now, enveloping Sarah, crawling into her skin, dragging her toward the mirror. Her legs kicked out in panic, but the shadows held her fast, as if they were feeding on her fear. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her throat. The cold was unbearable, the weight of the shadows pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. The woman's cries faded into nothing as Sarah's vision blurred. Her limbs went limp, and the last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was the woman's hollow, pleading eyes. Eyes that seemed to know exactly what would happen next. No one comes back. The darkness engulfed Sarah like a suffocating wave, and for a moment, she thought she might lose herself completely. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her chest constricting as she tried to scream, to cry out, but no sound came. Her limbs felt like lead, heavy and unresponsive, as if the shadows themselves were weighing her down, dragging her toward the depths of the mirror. The cold seeped into her skin, sinking deep into her bones, and for the first time since she'd entered the house, Sarah felt truly helpless. The whispers were louder now, deafening, swirling around her like 1,000 voices all speaking at once. She tried to fight them off, to push back against the shadows that surrounded her, but it was futile. The darkness wrapped around her like tendrils, tightening with every passing second, pulling her closer to the glass. No one comes back. The words, once a warning, now felt like a sentence. The phrase echoed in her mind, a mantra she couldn't escape. She felt like she was drowning in it, her thoughts muddled, her sense of self slipping away. She struggled, kicking, twisting, but the shadows were relentless. She could feel them creeping up her legs, her arms, wrapping around her torso, as if trying to pull her apart. Despair flooded her as she realized there was nowhere to go, no way to escape. The walls of the house, the mirror, everything was closing in on her. But then, just as she thought the darkness would consume her entirely, a sharp, sudden force yanked her backward, out of the cold, suffocating grip of the shadows. For a brief moment, she was free. The darkness retreated, and she gasped for air, her lungs burning as she sucked in the life-giving oxygen. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she collapsed to the ground, her heart racing, the pounding of it deafening in her ears. It took several moments before she could steady her breathing. When she finally looked up, she saw the figure from before, the one that had stood at the top of the stairs. It was standing in the doorway of the room, watching her with cold, unblinking eyes. For a moment, Sarah thought she had imagined it, an after effect of the shadowy grip, but the figure's presence was undeniable. It was tall, its features obscured in darkness, but its outline was unmistakable. It was waiting, watching her. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs trembling with the effort. Her pulse raced, her thoughts chaotic. She didn't know whether to run or confront the figure. The idea of running was tempting, almost instinctual, but something told her it would be futile. The house would just swallow her whole, as it had done to countless others. She knew this now. The figure before her was part of the house, a manifestation of the malevolent force that controlled everything here. The figure took a step forward, and the air grew colder still. A biting chill swept through the room, and Sarah shivered uncontrollably. She felt it then, the pressure. The weight of something ancient and hungry pressing down on her. It wasn't just the figure. It was the house. The house itself was alive, and it was closing in on her. "Who are you?" she forced out, her voice shaky but defiant. "What do you want?" The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it stepped closer, its movements deliberate and slow, like a predator stalking its prey. The air around it seemed to warp, as if reality itself was bending in its presence. Sarah's skin crawled as the temperature dropped even further. Finally, the figure spoke, its voice low and guttural, like gravel scraping against stone. "You should never have come here. You shouldn't have accepted the invitation." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had thought about turning back many times, but each time something dark, had kept her moving forward. The letter, the pull of Hollow Street. She had been lured into the house, just like everyone else before her. "Who are you?" she repeated, her voice stronger now, despite the fear that clutched at her chest. "What happened to the others? Why are you doing this?" The figure tilted its head slightly, its gaze never leaving hers. "They were all like you. Curious. They thought they could break the rules, that they could escape. But no one leaves this place. Once you step inside, you are bound to it. You become part of it." The words sent a shiver of terror down her spine. The house was more than just a physical structure. It was something ancient, something that fed on the souls of those who entered. And now, Sarah was part of it, forever bound to the darkness. She stumbled backward, but the figure's gaze followed her, its presence suffocating. The others? She choked out, her mind racing with questions. Where are they? What happened to them? The figure's lips curled into a twisted smile, though its face remained obscured by shadows. "They are here. All of them." The figure's hand reached out, and Sarah instinctively took a step back, though she knew it would be futile to flee. Trapped. Forever. Sarah's heart thundered in her chest as the implications of the figure's words sank in. The house didn't just trap people, it consumed them. They didn't disappear, they became part of the house, part of the endless torment that stretched on for eternity. The figures she'd had seen, the voices she'd heard, were they all like her? People who had come, who had accepted the invitation, and who had never left. The figure stepped closer, its presence pressing against her. She couldn't breathe. There's no escape. Suddenly, the room around her seemed to shift. The walls seemed to distort, warping and twisting like they were alive, the space bending impossibly. The mirror from earlier flickered, its surface reflecting not just her, but something else. Figures, shapes, faces. She recognized some of them. Familiar faces of people she had known, people who had disappeared over the years. Their eyes were wide with terror, their faces frozen in expressions of agony. They reached out toward her from the mirror, their hands pressing against the glass. "No," Sarah gasped, stepping back, her hands pressed to her ears. "No, this can't be real." But the faces in the mirror didn't fade. They didn't go away. Instead, they grew clearer, more distinct, their cries growing louder, more desperate. Sarah could hear them now, hear their pleas for help, their screams for release. The figure was standing behind her now, its cold breath on her neck. "They'll never let you go. You belong to us now." A cold hand touched her shoulder, and Sarah's vision blurred. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until she could no longer tell where the voices ended and her own thoughts began. The house was alive, a sentient being that had taken her body and soul. There was no escape, no way out. She felt the mirror's pull, the cold glass seeming to draw her closer, the figures reaching for her, their fingers brushing against the surface. She tried to scream, to fight it, but the force was too strong. She was being pulled, inch by inch, toward the mirror, toward the endless void of darkness that awaited her. The house had claimed her. There was no way back. No one comes back. Sarah's vision swam as she felt herself drawn toward the mirror. The faces in the glass reached out to her, their fingers pressing against the surface, their eyes wide with terror. She tried to turn away, but the force pulling her was undeniable. It was like a magnetic force, yanking her closer to the glass, to the souls trapped within. The house was alive, and it wanted her, body, soul, and mind. Her heart raced, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she struggled to break free of the invisible grip around her. She pushed against the floor with all her strength, but her legs felt like jelly, her limbs weak and unresponsive. Every attempt to move felt like wading through thick mud, the house fighting her at every turn. The voices were growing louder, more desperate. "Help us. Don't let it take you." She wanted to scream, but the words were stuck in her throat. The cold air seemed to wrap around her, suffocating her, until she thought her chest might implode from the pressure. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor, her body trembling with fear and exhaustion. Her mind screamed for release, for escape, but there was nowhere to go. The house was closing in on her, and she could feel its grip tightening with every passing second. The darkness around her seemed to pulse, as if it were alive, feeding off her fear, growing stronger with every moment. "No one comes back," the voice whispered again, this time not from the figure, but from everywhere, echoing through her mind, reverberating in her skull. The words clawed at her consciousness, digging into her brain, making her head throb with pain. No one escapes. She tried to block it out, tried to fight it, but it was impossible. The house was everywhere. It was in the walls, in the floor, in the very air she breathed. It was alive, feeding on her, draining her. The mirror's reflection flickered, and for a moment, Sarah thought she saw something else. Something moving behind her, something that wasn't a reflection at all. A figure. She whipped around, her pulse racing in her ears, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, silent, save for the whispering voices. "They're all gone," a voice rasped in her ear, so close it felt like it was coming from inside her head. "You're just another soul to add to the collection." She spun around again, but there was no one behind her. She was alone in the room, the shadows stretching and swirling as if mocking her. Terror gripped her heart. "No, no," she cried, her voice trembling. "I won't become like them. I won't let this happen." But deep down, a part of her knew that it was already too late. Her mind was unraveling, pieces of her thoughts slipping through the cracks like water through a sieve. The house was manipulating her, playing with her perceptions, warping her reality. It wasn't just the shadows or the whispers. It was everything. The very fabric of her mind was being eaten away. Her chest tightened. She could feel herself slipping. The house was no longer just a place. It was part of her now, rooted deep in her soul. She was becoming one with it, with the darkness that surrounded her. "Get out." A voice, clear and desperate, sliced through the madness in her mind. It was the woman from the room. "Please, you have to get out before it's too late. You don't have much time." Sarah's head snapped up. The woman, was she real? Had she somehow survived, or was she another figment of the house's twisted reality? "What?" What do you mean? Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse. How can I get out? I can't leave. It won't let me. The woman's face appeared in her mind, her expression pleading, her eyes wide with terror. The mirror, she whispered. The mirror is the key. It's the only way out. But you have to act fast. A shiver of hope ran through Sarah. The mirror. Was it truly the key? Could it be the way to escape this nightmare, to break free from the house's clutches? She forced herself to her feet, her limbs heavy, like they were made of lead. The voices screamed in her ears, their cries growing louder and more frantic, urging her to turn back, to give up. But Sarah's resolve was steel. She would not give in. Not like this. She stumbled toward the mirror, the darkness swirling around her like a thick fog. The figures inside the glass were still reaching for her, their fingers pressing against the surface, their faces twisted in agony. She didn't care. She was close. So close. Please, she whispered, her voice raw and strained. Let this be the way out. As she approached the mirror, she could feel a pull again, stronger now. The shadows tugged at her like invisible hands, dragging her toward the glass. But she pushed through, ignoring the pain, the terror. Her fingers brushed against the cold surface of the mirror, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The voices went silent. The house held its breath. Then, with a force that knocked the wind from her lungs, the mirror began to ripple. The surface of the glass distorted, as though it were water, warping and twisting as if trying to open into something else, something beyond. A light flickered within it, faint but bright, like a distant beacon in the darkness. For a moment, Sarah hesitated. Was this really it? Was this her chance to escape? You don't have much time. The woman's voice echoed in her mind again, urgent, pleading. It's going to pull you back. You have to go now. Without thinking, Sarah reached forward, her fingers trembling as they touched the mirror's surface. The cold seeped into her skin like ice, but she didn't pull away. She forced herself forward, pushing through the distortion. The glass felt like it was pulling her in, dragging her deeper, but Sarah didn't stop. She closed her eyes, clutching the edge of the mirror. She felt her body tremble, her muscles aching from the strain. The cold was unbearable, but she gritted her teeth, determined to escape. The light in the mirror flickered again, brighter this time, and the distortion grew stronger, pulling her in, threatening to consume her whole. She could feel the house fighting her, trying to drag her back into the abyss. No, she gasped, struggling against the pull. I won't stay. I won't stay in this place. With a final, desperate push, she forced herself through the mirror. Everything went white. The blinding white light swallowed Sarah whole, consuming her entirely. She felt as if her body was disintegrating, as though her very essence was being torn apart, ripped from the inside out. She gasped for air, but there was no air. She reached out, but there was nothing to grasp, no tangible reality beneath her fingers. She couldn't feel her legs, her arms. She couldn't even feel her own heartbeat. It was as if she were drifting through the emptiness of space, weightless, untethered. Her thoughts were fragmented, swirling in a haze of confusion. Was she alive? Was she dead? Had she escaped the house, or was she trapped in some twisted limbo? Then, as quickly as it had begun, the light faded. Sarah blinked, trying to focus, her head spinning. She found herself lying on a cold, hard surface. The ground beneath her was rough, uneven, and covered in dust. She pushed herself into a sitting position, her body aching from the strain. Her hands trembled as she wiped her eyes, trying to clear the disorienting fog from her mind. Her breath came in sharp, shallow gasps, her pulse hammering in her ears. Slowly, she raised her head. She was in a different place. It was dark, but the air felt fresher. There was no oppressive weight pressing down on her, no suffocating cold. She could breathe freely again. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed distant, almost comforting. There was a window, a faint outline of light filtering through it. It seemed real. I'm out, she whispered, her voice hoarse but full of wonder. She looked around the room, her eyes scanning every corner. It was small, the walls lined with old wooden shelves, some of them filled with books. The floor was covered in dust, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling. But there was something comforting about this place, something familiar. It felt like a forgotten room in a house that had long been abandoned, a place untouched by the horrors of the world. Could it be true? Had she really escaped the house? Was this another room entirely, or was it just an illusion created by the house's dark forces? But as Sarah stood up, she realized something. It was too quiet. No creaks of the old floorboards, no whispers, no sounds of footsteps. Only silence. A deafening, unnatural silence that filled the air with a sense of dread. A chill crept up her spine, a coldness that reminded her of the house, of the darkness that still clung to her. She turned her gaze to the door at the far side of the room. It was ajar, just slightly, as if beckoning her to step through. Her heart thudded in her chest, but she forced herself to move. She had to find out where she was, to see if the house was truly gone, or if she was still trapped in its nightmarish grasp. Taking cautious steps, Sarah crossed the room, her bare feet sinking into the dust. The door loomed ahead, its brass handle tarnished, the wood aged and cracked. She reached for it, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold metal. With a deep breath, she turned the handle and pushed the door open. What lay beyond took her breath away. It was another hallway, long and narrow, just like the ones she had seen in the house. The walls were adorned with faded, peeling wallpaper, and the floor was covered in the same dust she had just left behind. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the very space she stood in was holding its breath. It was the same. It was the house. She stumbled back, her mind racing, her heart pounding in her chest. No, it couldn't be. She had made it through the mirror. She had escaped. She had to have. "You're not free," a voice whispered from behind her. She spun around, her eyes wide, but there was no one there. The room behind her was empty, as it had been moments ago. And yet, the voice echoed in her mind, clear as day, like a warning. "No one comes back," it said again, more forceful this time. Her blood ran cold as the realization hit her. The house hadn't let her go. It hadn't released her. She was still trapped. The mirror hadn't been an escape. It had been a part of the trap. The walls of the room began to pulse, the shadows twisting in on themselves, as if the very structure of the house was alive, breathing, watching. Sarah backed away, her breath coming faster, her panic rising as she realized that no matter what she did, she couldn't escape. The door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang, and the lights flickered. For a moment, the room seemed to distort, the edges of her vision warping, as though the walls were closing in on her. The air grew thicker, colder. The whispers started again, louder now, more frantic. "You should never have come back." Sarah's heart raced as she turned in a circle, her mind spiraling into chaos. She couldn't think clearly. The whispers were too loud, too persistent, filling her head with thoughts of doom. She had thought she was free. She had thought she had made it out, but she was wrong. The house was still here, still inside her. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor, her hands clutching her head as if trying to hold her thoughts together. The darkness was closing in, swallowing her whole, the whispers growing louder with every passing second. Suddenly, she heard something else. Footsteps. Heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway outside the room. Her pulse skipped a beat as she listened, holding her breath. The footsteps stopped at the door. "Let me out," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse. "Please." But no answer came. The door remained silent. The footsteps grew louder again, closer now, as if someone, or something, was drawing nearer. She could feel its presence, could sense its malice, its hunger. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to escape, but the door remained firmly shut. There was nowhere to go. "It's coming," the voice whispered once more, closer this time, as if it were standing just behind her. She turned her head, but there was no one there. Only the shadows, moving, shifting, crawling along the walls like tendrils, reaching for her. "You can't escape," the voice hissed. "You belong to the house now." The door creaked open slowly, as if the house itself was savoring the moment. And then, out of the darkness, something stepped into the room. It was a figure, tall and gaunt, its features obscured in the shadows, but Sarah could feel its eyes on her. Cold, malevolent eyes that seemed to pierce her very soul. The figure took a step forward. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came. The house had won.